Joker 2 is better than Joker 1, and I'm tired of pretending it's not. Until like the last 30 minutes. Like, I'm silly, but I'm not that silly. Hear me out, I can explain. I agree that Joker 1 is a fantastic film. In my pointless ranking of my top 100 movies, it stands comfortably at a 21st, just under Bullet Train, which by the way, most underrated movie of like ever. You'd have to be rather fittingly joking if you think Joker 1 is by any means bad. Its exploration of the characters, its framing of events without relying on gimmicks or impressive set pieces. It's spectacular and downright iconic, making the viewer understand Arthur's psychology and reasons for becoming the Joker, all while being a decently innovative interpretation of the character, to the point where it basically birthed a new branch of Joker cosplay. What a nice color palette. These colors rather fit me, don't they? It's just that whenever I talk about Joker with people, eventually I end up blurting out how I actually think the movie is piss fucking boring on rewatches, much to the dismay of everyone in the conversation that has only seen it once. And they all think I'm deranged about it, which I get. You don't often hear negatives about this movie being described with such colorful language as mine. That usually also comes with a barrage of comments about why I'm wrong and why these boring bits in the middle are kinda necessary, as I frantically try to explain that I don't think they shouldn't be part of the film, because the issues with it aren't related to the dialogue or the events in the story, but rather on the structure of the film's narrative writing. You see, Joker isn't written like every movie. In a rather subtle move, Joker was written with the Waterfall Structure. No, that doesn't mean Joker's wet, and I know that's hurting the occasional audience member who strongly advocates for Joker becoming a Tumblr sexy man. But there is this scene in Joker 2 where he's pretty wet, but I digress. It means the film withholds its payoffs during the middle portion of the film to satisfyingly do it closer to the end in order to make a better impression with the viewers. Something which Joker 2 is much better at, but more on that later. Let's first look at the way most narratives work. The story starts in scene A, and then it goes to scene B, then C, so on and so forth. You need the context of scene A for scene B, unless they are each setting up stuff for a further scene, say scene F. Without that context, the story would either make no sense or have a lack of impact because plot points wouldn't be sufficiently established. I'm gonna focus on the second type because the first one is honestly rather redundant, and having that issue would mean you have fundamentally failed. Meanwhile, a perfectly fine plot where the influx and resolution of plot elements isn't satisfying, let alone effective, is just passable, I guess. It's what separates logic and talent when it comes to writing, if that makes any sense. You see, plot developments, whether it's a character arc, a goal, or just some background activity someone's doing as a scene happens, need to be established, developed, and resolved. Core themes are often built around the biggest of these events, say a movie like Into the Spider-Verse, setting up early on that the main character feels overwhelmed by his and other people's expectations for himself, a problem that is exasperated through becoming Spider-Man, where now expectations of him have grown to those of the prior Spider-Man, and this eventually leads up to a fundamental conflict that forces the character into raising above the problem in what ended up being one of the best scenes ever put to film of all time. It's not like the scene right before this one establishes all of the nuances of it. Most of those are established way earlier with details like Miles' stickage to surfaces being solidly brought back when his sticky fingers shatter the glass before the leap, or his shoelace being finally tied after they repeatedly mess him up throughout the film. So how do other films that aren't Joker 2 play with this? Naturally, not every movie has this structure, since writing is still a creative art that allows the one making it to follow different rules. Most notably, something like Pulp Fiction or Kill Bill, movies where scene D may happen chronologically before scene A, but the writer still established plot points to be understood in watch order. Last year the game Mouthwashing came out, and executes this perfectly by mangling the story and perspective character, because otherwise the story would be rather clear cut. Splitting it up like this basically gives the whole structure its backbone. You guys should totally play Mouthwashing if you haven't. The Game Awards not nominating it for Best Narrative is like an insult. Another example would be flashbacks. They aren't anything atypical to story structure by any means. In fact, most good stories will include a substantial amount of flashbacks to explore character complexities, but they often explain actions that were established earlier more than anything. Allow me to visualize my point for you. This is how most stories set up, develop, and pay off plot points. Every color has 3 dots that represent each of these steps in this example, and they are relatively evened out. We call this pacing. The introduction and resolution of different storylines are spread out so that the influx of information for the audience is not overwhelming or underwhelming, each of which would result in the film feeling too fast or too slow. Some of the resolutions are actually used as the introduction for new plot points, which leads to clearer writing. And as someone who'd like to write something in the future, how my thoughts level achieve such cleanliness? This is hard, and most movies don't even do it this cleanly. There's also scenarios where some films are good because they break this, so don't think of this example as a rule, it's rather a constant. Now this here is how Joker 1 does its structure. What's happened here? The basics of the Waterfall Structure can be seen such as this little example I came up with while thinking about this video in the shower. The audience is looking at an ocean full of water at the very start of the film. The filmmakers then get very close and personal to whatever salmon they'll want to call the protagonist. Here they introduce details such as who the salmon is, Arthur Fleck, what they want to be a comedian, what they need to be free from the S-word. Slut? No. Society. And why the audience should at least care for what happens to them. He is sad or something, I don't know. They aim for making him appealing through sympathy and the injustices that happened to him during the opening minutes of the film with the whole getting beat up by children thing. Point is, it's all at the beginning. No film can get viewers invested if it doesn't start establishing things early on. In fact, during the start of the story, audiences are more willing to understand information because they know the basics of it are incredibly important to their understanding of the movie as a whole. The first plot point is always like this spinning globe though, or sometimes it's a castle. Those are logos. Wait, now everyone's gonna think I'm stupid. I just invalidated the entire video. No, but for real, even in YouTube you can see how big creators bloat the start of the video with editing, clips and exciting promises, and then they try to get you distracted until minute 6 where they pretty much stop trying. It's a similar situation with films. You're most attentive at the start for a mountain of reasons which I won't go into very much since this video isn't about that, it's about how Joker 2 made me angry. What separates the start of the story with the point where elements begin to stall is the moment the salmon enters the river, or what I like to call the tip-off point. This is in Joker the little part where he shoots and kills 3 young men. The 3 young men. Now, I kinda use the word stall because... hit it! Now, I kinda use the word stall because it definitely looks like it from my diagram, and to some extent it is true, but I think a better term would be on hold. It's not like this plot point revolving the 3 young men is never brought up again. It's actually a massive driving force for the plot, directing the flow of the story that by my metaphor is the river. It's just that the payoff is cleverly concealed and built on so that the eventual confession is a lot more rewarding and exciting for the audience. The last 30 minutes leave a strong impression, making viewers walk away thinking, wow, that was amazing! This comes with a huge benefit and a huge issue. The benefit is what I just said. You know what the audience remembers best at the end of the film? That's right, the most recent thing they saw, in other words, the ending. By putting all of the payoff at the end, you can really trick the audience into forgetting much of their problems with the film until then. It sort of recontextualizes some of those budding pitfalls as an intentional bit of tension building or a minor element to be overshadowed by more obvious, better composed elements. Then's the negative. My problem with Joker, and I know I've been long-winded here on whatever, but I really want to stress that I simply want to get my point across in a useful manner to other aspiring writers. So I am explaining it in a lot of detail, but by no means am I saying Joker 1 is bad. I can already see the comments, but remember, this is my perspective as someone who analyzes how film is written when I see something good. Bad movies don't get this treatment because it's easy to see the problems, where spectacular movies have more detailed and nuanced caveats as a result. They are naturally harder to take issue in. Okay. The negative is how during the middle of the story, absolutely nothing happens. Sure, you get a bunch of scenes with more stillness and slight escalation that keeps a first-time audience wishing to know what happens next, but the rest of the audiences, they're just kinda waiting for the important bits near the end. It's like that iconic scene in the toilet which Alexandra Roman here insists is better than the entirety of Joker 2. But I'm sorry, that scene is too avant-garde and establishes little of purpose for the film. He is calming himself down through interpretative dance. I do that when I get comments ignoring something I spent like 30 seconds explaining earlier and I know what you're doing right now! This 5-second clip was too avant-garde and established little. I am thanking my own viewer attention to make a point. That doesn't invalidate the power and artistry of the scene. I'm aiming at saying Joker doesn't do this structure to perfection. The influx of information and start of new plot points is not spread out. Good waterfall structures make the river wider with more problems as the film goes on. I always like pointing out Parasite as a film that has a really good waterfall structure, with most of its elements adding to the river rather than riding along throughout. Its equivalent to the Murray shooting scene is much more impactful, in part because its magnitude isn't nearly as evident to predict. That's where Joker 2 comes in and flip-flops this structure on its head. Joker 2 spreads its setups much more evenly, keeping the narrative engaging from start to finish. But does it deliver on the premises in the end? Well, that's when things get messy. I went to watch this at the cinema during premiere week, and this is a picture of the completely empty theater. Your eyes do not deceive you, I sneak in a 1-liter bottle of Dr. Pepper when I go watch a film in the cinema. Joker 2, still in Waterfall Structure, contains a lot of events that would ideally impact the end of the story as well as Arthur's character arc, which, by the way, I actually love the intro scene of this film a lot more than most scenes in Joker 1, but back to the film, it introduces information a lot more steadily, and it's a tense watching experience if you look at it without bias. So many people watch this with bias, they've heard from critics, when it really isn't that bad at all, and there's some considerable over-exaggerating due to the hype being expectedly too high. The problem then isn't that it doesn't pay off its setups, but rather that it straight up pays them off in the exact opposite direction. Case in point, and spoilers to surprise no one, I expected it since they announced the gosh dang movie, Joker's death. Like, That's a huge detail, massive even. It's literally the end of the character's story and barely gets established in the film to such evident degrees it stands out even if you've never looked at how film writing works. Like, there's 3 key scenes pertinent to the character who actually delivers the payoff, and he's always in a different shot as if he wasn't part of the original script, but more on that later. So like, what's my diagram looking like in regards to this plot point? Because it probably looks a little like space, stars! Nothing here makes absolute sense. Case in point, let's look at Harley Quinn's arc. Her goal is to leech popularity off of Arthur and his Joker persona. They developed this, yet her motivations flip-flop between using Arthur and genuinely liking him, with the final film undermining this arc entirely, favoring superficial drama over depth, with the excuse that she's attracted to Joker's killing rather than any of Arthur's actions through the plot, even though the persona she'd apparently be falling in love with is the Arthur persona, of whom she'd had no idea before the start of the plot according to the finalized movie, because they removed the implication that she looked into his life as Arthur as you can spot in the trailer. But I'm really getting off the rails. Point is, they develop her character, but they refuse to actually establish anything formally in an attempt to limit our audience perspective of her to Arthur's point of view. A decision that would have kinda slapped if it had been the author's original intention. Look at Harvey Dent. He hard fucks and hard fucking sucks. Sure, they establish who he is and show up a payoff with the explosion that creates Two-Face, but the audience doesn't get a single event that makes this payoff anything more than a facial makeover. By the sound of all this, yeah, the movie's structure is an even larger failure than the originals. However, in lieu of that, they ended up creating an endlessly more entertaining film. The introduction of new information and developments is so much more consistent, avoiding uploading the original film used to make its third act more impactful. Had the first 2 acts properly led up to the satisfying conclusion that should have existed regardless of the film's structure, we'd have a much better film that may rival and even beat the first film. Once again, you remember most the end of the film, so a great journey with a lacking destination is not going to be properly appreciated, particularly because poetic conclusion makes it easier to remember details, at least in my experience. If you think Joker 2 was boring, I mean, all power to you, but most likely the lack of payoff affected your perception, which is expected and you'd be in the right. So like, Arthur's arc is well executed if it had the proper conclusion it was leading up to, which I am gathering mostly from foreshadowing and some cinematographic peculiarities I noticed. The start of the film is already establishing what his internal conflict for this film is, this debate over whether he is Joker or Arthur, then the way he feels like his actions as Joker thrust an expectation and responsibility onto Arthur. Throughout the first film, we do see a clear separation regarding his attitude as Joker or Arthur, and it's easy to separate your personality based on what you believe others expect of you. Basically, he always wanted to be a performer, and now that he actually gets the chance to perform for the world, it's only thanks to the reprehensive actions he took. He isn't prepared to take the responsibility and all that it entails, including the fact that he has been given the opportunity to fight against that which was used to oppress him. Yes, this would mirror a hero's development, a theme which the movie decided to shove under its taint for reasons I wish I could begin to understand. Then the rest of the film sees Arthur try to approach his issues as Joker or as Arthur, a trait others around him assumed. Not even the people on his side want to acknowledge he is one and the same, except for Harley, hence his attraction for her as established by the very film. We get instances of Arthur's inability to accept his Joker side having a negative effect on his trial, as well as the opposite leading to the same result. Too bad this payoff takes a 180 turn right at the finish line, doesn't it? The movie does arrive at his realization that he is responsible for his actions, but it's done by him renouncing the Joker persona, letting all the blame fall upon his Arthur persona, which lines up a little too well with the intro animation. It's almost like the character had no development and is simply saying stuff knowing where it's obviously going to lead. Yes, we're here. The part where I say this film was extremely close to being good. The clues are everywhere as a result of retrofitting the most costly scenes back into the new plot. And yes, it's a little delusional, but I swear, I am sober. Exhibit 1 is my favorite line in the whole film, a line that makes so little sense it had me bursting out laughing in the theater, and I remind you this was the room, so I wasn't just laughing, I was shamelessly laughing. Take it away, film that has been flipped and has an ugly overlay and a filter and the audio is modified because YouTube copyright system is trash.
I'm the same guy that murdered Marie Franklin.
No, you're not.
What? Let me simplify this if you don't see the issue. This dialogue is translatable to "My favorite flavor of ice cream is pistachio." Nope, you're lactose intolerant and milk isn't real. It's almost like someone needed an excuse for Harley to break up with Joker, and their decision was for her to take this court statement at heart, without realizing their attempt to recontextualize the film's prior context was entirely betrayed by the very thing. She fell in love with Arthur and wanted to use Joker. This is what was established, not the other way around. Not only that, but he's literally accepting he is both in the fucking dialogue. She doesn't even consider if this is some sort of angle before the explosion. Which, by the way, someone blew up the courthouse is repeated like 4 times. Someone! You know what character wasn't in the explosion scene? Harley. There's evidence suggesting the original ending had her as the one who blows up the courthouse, but instead, we got an off-screen radio show her name to say, "Someone blew up the whorehouse." I don't know if you heard me, Harley. Someone blew up the courthouse! But let's assume I'm just high on Galaxy Gas. They didn't do a reshoot where a random cop comes in doing the parts with worse cinematography to drag Arthur into the very random and unassuming position of the place right where the explosion's gonna happen, where someone who wanted to blow up a courthouse on purpose would stand in for theatrics and effect, and fans of them would certainly avoid exploding the deliberately timed explosion the moment their idol stood in the place where he would likely die from the explosion. Let's assume there was no foul play, that this is all as intended with no modification. You're putting the trailer shots on the screen right now, aren't you? You're doing this on purpose. Let's try this again. It's kind of a shame, because it's incredibly easy to see how the pieces of this story could have fit together into a good waterfall structure. I suspect that, as foreshadowed by the film, most literally through the plot points it manages to develop and intertwine back into the final story. The original ending, I suspect, had Harley shooting Joker and killing him. This as a commentary of how the fanatism around Joker 1 and the obsession people have for flanderizing his character into a less dimensional statement quite literally ended up killing the real statement of the film. But I don't know, that's just me. What I'm sure isn't just me, however, is the final takeaway I had from this Joker duology. The most important part of a story is the ending. Regardless of waterfalls or no waterfalls, it's to my belief that endings shape the audience's perception of a story, not only by nature of being the last thing they see or because of its impact, but rather because it's the lens by which the audience interprets the film. People have a tendency to turn a blind eye to the development of a story, in part because it's too much information, in part because they haven't grown to trust the storyteller. Watching an enjoyable film involves your brain connecting the dots from the ending backwards, because everything that doesn't come into play later is either charming or useless. Joker 2 came out as such a failure, not because the ending was simply outrageous, but also because audiences trusted the storytellers due to its nature as a sequel which runs into the very same problem that makes life so frustrating. Despite the fact that we all live it forwards, life can only be understood backwards. I think part of what makes films or shows or books or video games or whatever satisfying to experience is the fact that they are to some extent conclusive. Even if it's just the end of a season, or even if the show doesn't have an ending due to cancellation or whatever, simply the notion of a destination is enough to allow us to live vicariously through the worlds within them, the characters they show, and unlike real life, we know behind them exists an artist who intends for them to live up to the expectations they are establishing in their work. We don't wonder what happens to the characters alone, we wonder what the author wishes for the characters to experience, and that cursory degree of separation from reality let us put down our guards and let the narrator take us wherever they desire. Without endings, stories would just be a group of paragraphs, and because of that, the weight we place upon them, whether we are making or experiencing them, is precisely the world. So yeah, fuck Joker 2, it could have been incredible, but they decided to take the great world of the first movie, gave it a lollipop, decorated it for Christmas, and smeared it in shit. Did anyone notice I refused to say the actual name of Joker 2 because I couldn't bring myself to learn its pronunciation, by the way? Fine, you made it to the end of the video, you deserve to know how I pronounce this. Folie.